My fiancée left me at the altar for her yoga instructor. I'm now wearing her sister's jacket with a plane ticket to Paris in the pocket. I was standing at the altar in a rented tuxedo that cost more than my monthly car payment when the wedding coordinator walked down the aisle with an envelope instead of my bride. The church was packed with 200 people who had flown in from across the country. The string quartet was playing Pachelbel's Canon in D for the third time, and Father Michael was checking his watch with increasing concern. The coordinator, a woman named Bethany, who charged $3,000 to manage this disaster, handed me the envelope with trembling hands and whispered that Natalie had left this in the bridal suite 20 minutes ago. I opened it standing there in front of everyone and read 7 words written in her perfect handwriting on hotel stationery that said she was sorry, but she couldn't do this, and she was leaving with Damien. Damien was her yoga instructor, the guy with the man bun and sleeve tattoos who she'd been taking classes from for 6 months and who I'd met exactly twice at studio events where he talked about chakras and energy and didn't make eye contact with me. I stood there holding the note while 200 people stared at me in absolute silence, and the only thought in my head was that I'd told my mother Natalie's obsession with hot yoga was getting weird, and my mother had said exercise was healthy and I should be supportive. I'd been planning this wedding for 14 months with Natalie, who I met in graduate school when we were both getting our master's degrees in business administration. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, and I was in finance at an investment firm downtown. We moved in together after a year, got engaged on a beach in Mexico after 3 years, and spent the last 14 months arguing about centerpieces and invitation fonts and whether we needed a live band or a DJ. Natalie wanted everything perfect because her older sister Olivia had eloped to Vegas 5 years ago, and their mother never let her forget what a disappointment that was. So we were doing the full traditional wedding with the church ceremony and the country club reception and the 5-tier cake and the ice sculpture shaped like swans. I went along with everything because Natalie seemed to care so much, and I just wanted her happy. She started taking yoga classes in January at this studio called Sacred Flow that opened near our apartment. She went 3 times a week at first, then 5 times a week, then twice a day some weeks. She said it helped with her stress from work and wedding planning. I thought it was excessive, but I didn't say much because she seemed lighter and happier than she'd been in months. She talked about her instructor Damien like he was some kind of spiritual guru who understood the universe in ways normal people couldn't comprehend. I met Damien the first time in March when Natalie dragged me to a studio open house event. He was 32 with dirty blonde hair pulled into a bun, full sleeve tattoos of lotus flowers and Sanskrit phrases, and this way of talking where everything sounded profound but meant nothing. He told me my aura was blocked and I should try his advanced flow class to release the tension I was carrying in my shoulders. Natalie watched him the entire time he was talking to me with this expression I'd never seen on her face before, like she was studying him, memorizing him. I felt uncomfortable and told Natalie on the drive home that her instructor seemed like he was trying too hard. She got defensive and said I was being judgmental and closed-minded, and couldn't I just support something that made her feel good? I dropped it because we were already fighting about whether to serve chicken or fish at the reception, and I didn't have energy for another argument. The second time I met Damien was in May at a charity yoga event in the park that Natalie insisted we attend. He led a group session with 50 people on mats while sunrise happened behind him, and afterward Natalie introduced me as her fiancée like she was embarrassed by the word. Damien shook my hand with both of his hands and said marriage was a beautiful journey if both people were willing to evolve together. I noticed he held Natalie's hand for several seconds longer than necessary when she thanked him for the session. The warning signs were obvious in retrospect, but I was working 60-hour weeks trying to close a major deal before the wedding and barely saw Natalie except when we were addressing envelopes or meeting with caterers. She started staying out later after her evening classes, saying the studio had meditation sessions that ran long. She stopped asking me to come to bed and would stay up watching yoga videos on her laptop with headphones in. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she was just nervous about the wedding and needed space to process her feelings. I gave her space because that's what you do when someone asks for it. I trusted her completely because in 5 years together she'd never given me a reason not to trust her. She was organized and dependable and showed up when she said she would. She remembered birthdays and planned thoughtful surprises and made me feel like I was the most important person in her world. Until suddenly I wasn't anymore, and I didn't even notice when that shift happened. Her sister Olivia called me 3 weeks before the wedding and asked if Natalie seemed different to me lately. I said she was stressed about wedding planning but otherwise fine. Olivia said Natalie had stopped returning her calls, and when they did talk, Natalie seemed distracted and distant. She asked if I thought Natalie was having second thoughts about getting married. I laughed and said Natalie had been planning this wedding for over a year and was obsessed with every detail, so no, I didn't think she was having second thoughts. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in June at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, where Natalie's parents got married 30 years ago. The rehearsal dinner was Friday night at an Italian restaurant her mother picked out, and Natalie barely spoke to me the entire evening. She sat at the opposite end of the table talking to her bridesmaids and checking her phone constantly. I asked her twice if she was okay, and she said she was fine, just tired. Her mother gave a toast about how she'd been waiting for this day since Natalie was a little girl playing bride with bedsheets and flowers from the garden. Natalie's father gave a toast about trusting me to take care of his daughter and welcoming me to the family. I gave a toast about how lucky I was to marry someone as amazing as Natalie and how I couldn't wait to start our life together. Natalie didn't give a toast. She said she'd save her words for the wedding day. After dinner, I tried to kiss her goodnight in the parking lot, and she turned her head so I caught her cheek instead of her lips. She said she'd see me at the altar tomorrow and drove away in her car before I could ask what was wrong. I stood there watching her taillights disappear and told myself she was just overwhelmed and everything would be fine once we got through the ceremony. Saturday morning, I got ready at my parents' house with my best man, Kevin, and 2 groomsmen from college. We put on our tuxedos and took shots of whiskey, even though it was only 10 in the morning because Kevin said it was tradition and would calm my nerves. I wasn't nervous about marrying Natalie. I was excited to finally be done with the planning and start our actual marriage. We drove to the church at noon for photos before the ceremony started at 2. The photographer posed us on the steps and in the sanctuary and outside by the gardens while we waited for Natalie to arrive with her bridesmaids. 1 o'clock came and went with no sign of her. The photographer called Bethany the wedding coordinator, who said the bridal party was running a few minutes late, but everything was fine. 1:30 came and Bethany looked less confident. She called Natalie's maid of honor, who said they were at the hotel doing final touches and would be there soon. 1:45 came, and Father Michael suggested I wait in his office instead of standing around in the sanctuary, where early arriving guests were starting to take their seats. I sat in a leather chair surrounded by books about theology and told myself this was normal wedding day chaos, and Natalie would show up any minute laughing about some crisis with her dress or hair that seemed important at the time but wouldn't matter once we were married. 2 o'clock arrived, and the church was full, and Natalie still wasn't there. Bethany came into Father Michael's office looking pale and said she'd driven to the hotel to check on the bridal party herself. The suite was empty. Natalie's dress was hanging in the closet still in its garment bag. Her makeup was laid out on the bathroom counter untouched. Her bridesmaids were gone and not answering their phones. There was an envelope on the bed with my name written on it in Natalie's handwriting. Bethany handed me the envelope and left the office while I opened it. Inside was a single piece of hotel stationery with 7 words that ended my engagement and started whatever this nightmare was becoming. The note said she was sorry, but she couldn't marry me, and she was leaving with Damien to figure out what she really wanted from life. She said I deserved someone who was certain, and she wasn't certain anymore. She said she hoped I could forgive her someday, but she understood if I couldn't. She signed it with just her initial like we were business associates, instead of people who'd spent 5 years building a life together. I read the note 3 times trying to make the words mean something different than what they obviously meant. Father Michael knocked on the door and asked what I wanted to do about the 200 people waiting in the church. I told him the truth because lying seemed pointless. I walked out to the altar alone and stood there while Bethany handed me the envelope so everyone could witness my humiliation together. The church erupted into chaos immediately after I read the note out loud. Natalie's mother screamed, and her father had to physically restrain her from running out to her car to go find Natalie and drag her back. My mother burst into tears, and my father looked like he wanted to kill someone but didn't know who. Natalie's bridesmaids were calling and texting her frantically with no response. Guests were taking photos and recording videos on their phones because apparently public humiliation needed documentation. Father Michael tried to calm everyone down and suggested we all pray for guidance and understanding. Kevin grabbed my arm and pulled me into a side room off the sanctuary before I had to listen to prayers about a situation that felt beyond any kind of divine intervention. He asked what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to get extremely drunk and pretend this day never happened. Kevin said the reception venue was already set up and paid for, and we might as well use it since 200 people had cleared their schedules and traveled here. He said we could turn it into a party instead of a wedding reception and at least salvage something from this disaster. I agreed, because the alternative was going home to the apartment I shared with Natalie and seeing all her things and the wedding presents stacked in our spare bedroom and the framed engagement photos on the walls. We announced to the church that we were moving the gathering to the country club as planned, but it would now be a party instead of a reception. Most people came, probably out of morbid curiosity or pity, or because they were hungry, and the country club had already prepared dinner for 200. The ballroom looked exactly like Natalie had planned it, with white roses on every table and string lights hanging from the ceiling and place cards with everyone's names in calligraphy. The DJ played music, but nobody danced. People clustered in groups, whispering and staring at me while I sat at what should have been the head table with Kevin and my groomsmen. Natalie's parents left after 20 minutes, her mother still crying and her father looking 10 years older than he had that morning. My parents stayed but kept their distance like they didn't know what to say to me. The bartender made me a drink that was supposed to be for toasts, but I drank it in 3 long swallows and asked for another. Kevin suggested I slow down, but I told him this was my almost wedding party and I'd drink however much I wanted. The 5-tier cake sat untouched on a table by itself because cutting it required a couple, and I was suddenly very single and very publicly humiliated. Olivia showed up at the country club an hour into the party wearing jeans and a leather jacket instead of the bridesmaid dress she was supposed to wear in the ceremony. She walked straight to my table and sat down without asking permission. She looked furious in a way that made her beautiful in a sharp, dangerous way I'd never noticed before. She said she'd been trying to call Natalie for 2 hours with no answer, and she wanted me to know she had no idea this was going to happen. She said if she'd known Natalie was planning to bail, she would have locked her in a room until she came to her senses, or at least told me privately, instead of letting me find out in front of 200 people. I believed her, because Olivia had always been straightforward and honest in a way Natalie sometimes wasn't. Where Natalie calculated and planned and controlled every detail, Olivia acted on instinct and said what she meant without filtering. She asked if I was okay, and I said no, obviously not. I'd just been left at the altar for a yoga instructor with a man bun. Olivia said Damien was a pretentious fraud who probably couldn't even spell chakra correctly. She said Natalie had lost her mind and thrown away the best relationship she'd ever had for some midlife crisis fantasy that would implode in 6 weeks. I asked how she could be so sure it would implode, and Olivia said because she knew her sister and Natalie always ran away when things got real and serious and permanent. She said Natalie had done the same thing in college when she got accepted to medical school, but dropped out after 1 semester because she panicked about the commitment. She said Natalie sabotaged every good thing in her life right before it became something she couldn't escape from. We sat there drinking while the party slowly emptied out around us. People kept approaching to offer condolences like someone had died instead of just ruining my life and disappearing with a yoga instructor. Kevin eventually left with the groomsmen after making me promise I wouldn't drive home. My parents came over to say goodbye, and my mother hugged me for a long time without speaking. My father said he'd always thought Natalie was flighty, but he'd hoped she'd grown out of it. They left, and it was just me and Olivia sitting at a table surrounded by white roses and empty chairs. She asked where I was planning to sleep tonight, and I said probably the apartment, even though the idea of going back there made me want to throw up. She said she had a hotel room booked for the wedding weekend, and I could crash there if I didn't want to be alone. I said that was probably a good idea since being alone sounded dangerous, given my current mental state and alcohol consumption. We gathered my things, and she drove us to her hotel in her car because I was in no condition to drive anywhere. The hotel was nice, one of those boutique places downtown with exposed brick and modern furniture. Her room had a king bed and a couch and a minibar that I immediately rated for more alcohol, despite Olivia's protests that I'd already had enough. I woke up on Sunday morning on the hotel couch with a blanket over me and sunlight stabbing through the windows directly into my eyes. My head felt like someone had taken a hammer to it repeatedly, and my mouth tasted like I'd been chewing on pennies. Olivia was sitting on the bed drinking coffee and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I groaned and said good morning with absolutely no sympathy in her voice. She handed me a bottle of water and 2 aspirin and told me to take them before I tried to speak. I swallowed the pills and drank the entire bottle of water in one go. She asked if I remembered everything from last night, and I said unfortunately, yes. Every humiliating detail was burned into my brain forever. She said her phone had been blowing up all morning with texts from family and friends who'd been at the wedding. Natalie's mother had apparently sent a group text to every relative saying Natalie had made a terrible mistake, but would come to her senses soon and we'd reschedule the wedding. I laughed because the idea of rescheduling after what she'd done was absolutely insane. Olivia agreed and said her mother lived in denial about everything, including the fact that Natalie was clearly having some kind of breakdown or affair, or both. I checked my own phone and found 37 text messages, 19 missed calls, and 12 voicemails. Most were from friends and coworkers who'd heard what happened and wanted to make sure I was okay. 3 were from my boss at the investment firm, saying to take as much time as I needed and not worry about coming into the office Monday. 1 was from Kevin saying he'd gone to my apartment and packed me a bag of clothes and toiletries because he figured I wouldn't want to go back there yet. He'd left the bag with the hotel concierge. I had nothing from Natalie, not a single message explaining or apologizing or acknowledging what she'd done. Olivia saw my face and asked if I'd heard from her sister. I said no and showed her my phone. She looked disgusted and said that was typical Natalie behavior, running away from consequences and expecting everyone else to deal with the aftermath of her choices. She said when Natalie eloped to Vegas, she didn't tell anyone until 3 days later when she called from a hotel room to announce she'd gotten married. Their mother didn't speak to her for 6 months. Natalie ended up getting that marriage annulled 4 months later because she realized she'd made a mistake, but by then, the damage to the family relationships was done. I spent Sunday at the hotel watching television and trying not to think about anything. Kevin brought my bag of clothes and stayed for an hour, making sure I ate something and wasn't planning to do anything stupid. He said everyone at the wedding was talking about what happened, and the general consensus was that Natalie was an idiot, and I deserved better. I appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't make me feel any less humiliated or angry or confused. Olivia ordered room service for dinner, and we ate pasta while watching some action movie neither of us paid attention to. She said I could stay at the hotel as long as I needed, and she'd already extended her reservation through the week. I asked why she was being so nice to me when her sister had just destroyed my life. She said because I didn't deserve what Natalie did, and someone needed to make sure I didn't fall apart completely. She said she'd always liked me better than most of Natalie's previous boyfriends who were usually selfish or boring or both. She said I was kind and steady and genuine, and her sister was throwing away something valuable for a fantasy that wouldn't last. Around midnight, Olivia's phone finally rang with a call from Natalie. She answered on speaker so I could hear. Natalie's voice came through sounding small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. She asked Olivia where she was and if she'd seen me. Olivia said she was at a hotel with me making sure I didn't have a complete mental breakdown after being abandoned at the altar in front of 200 people. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then Natalie said she knew what she did was awful, but she couldn't go through with the wedding when she had feelings for someone else. Olivia asked if she meant feelings for Damien, the yoga instructor, who she'd known for 6 months, versus the man she'd been with for 5 years and planned a life with. Natalie got defensive and said I wouldn't understand, because I'd never questioned whether I was on the right path or wondered if there was something more authentic and meaningful waiting if I was brave enough to reach for it. Olivia said running away from your wedding to chase a yoga instructor wasn't brave. It was cowardly and cruel and selfish. She said I deserved an explanation and an apology at minimum. Natalie said she couldn't talk to me yet because she needed time to figure out her feelings. Olivia said she'd had plenty of time to figure out her feelings before she left me at the altar, and maybe she should have used some of that time to break up with me privately instead of publicly humiliating me. Natalie started crying and said she knew she'd messed up, but she was scared and confused, and Damien made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Olivia said that was probably just good sex and endorphins from yoga making her think she was having some kind of spiritual awakening. Natalie hung up. Monday morning, I forced myself to shower and put on real clothes from the bag Kevin had packed. I couldn't avoid my apartment forever, and I needed to face the reality of my situation at some point. Olivia offered to come with me, but I said I should do this alone. I drove to the apartment complex where Natalie and I had lived together for 3 years. Her car wasn't in our assigned parking spot, which meant she either hadn't been back since Friday or she'd already moved out. I unlocked the door and walked into a space that looked exactly the same as when I'd left Saturday morning to get married. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Her coffee mug was still in the sink from Friday morning. Her side of the closet was still full of clothes and shoes. The wedding presents were still stacked in the spare bedroom unopened. The only difference was a note on the kitchen counter that said she'd come by Sunday night to get some things, and she'd be back later in the week to figure out next steps. Next steps felt like corporate language for ending a relationship, clinical and distant, and completely inadequate for the situation. I sat on the couch where we'd watched countless movies and ate countless dinners and talked about our future that was supposed to start with a wedding that never happened. My phone rang, and I saw it was my mother calling for the 3rd time that morning. I answered, and she immediately started asking how I was doing, and if I'd eaten anything, and whether I wanted to come stay with them for a while. I said I was fine, and staying with Olivia, and would figure things out soon. My mother asked if I'd heard from Natalie, and I said only through Olivia's phone last night. My mother said she'd received a call from Natalie's mother, who was absolutely beside herself and convinced this was all a misunderstanding that could be fixed if everyone just calmed down and talked rationally. I said there was nothing rational about leaving your fiancé at the altar for a yoga instructor. My mother agreed and said she'd told Natalie's mother the same thing, but some people couldn't accept when their children made terrible choices. She said I should focus on taking care of myself and not worry about what anyone else thought or expected. I promised I would, and ended the call before she could ask more questions I didn't have answers to. I spent 2 hours packing boxes with Natalie's things because I couldn't stand looking at her belongings everywhere. Her yoga mats in the corner, her supplements on the kitchen counter, her magazine subscriptions arriving in the mail. Every item felt like evidence of a life that had been a lie, or at least a partial truth she'd hidden behind, until she couldn't anymore. I stacked the boxes in the spare bedroom next to the wedding gifts we'd registered for and would now have to return. The irony wasn't lost on me that we'd asked people to buy us dishes and towels and picture frames for a home we'd never share as a married couple. I went back to the hotel, exhausted and emotionally drained from spending time in an apartment that felt haunted by a future that wouldn't happen. Olivia took one look at my face and ordered pizza and put on a comedy special without asking what I needed. She'd worked remotely from the hotel all day doing something with graphic design that I didn't fully understand. She said she'd gotten 15 messages from family members asking for updates on Natalie and me. She'd ignored all of them because she wasn't a messenger service for her sister's mess. I appreciated her loyalty more than I could express. We ate pizza, and I laughed at jokes I didn't really find funny, but made the effort because Olivia was trying to help, and I didn't want to be completely miserable company. Around 10 that night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it and saw a photo of Natalie and Damien sitting at an outdoor cafe in what looked like a European city based on the architecture. They were holding hands across the table and smiling at each other like they were the only 2 people in the world. The text below the photo said they'd arrived in Paris that morning and Damien was showing her what it meant to truly live in the moment. Paris. They'd gone to Paris, the city we'd talked about visiting on our honeymoon, the city where I'd planned to take her after the wedding, the city that was supposed to be our romantic adventure together. Except now she was there with a yoga instructor who talked about chakras and energy while I was sitting in a hotel room eating pizza with her sister. I showed Olivia the text and photo without saying anything because words felt insufficient for the level of betrayal and rage I was experiencing. Her face went completely still and cold in a way that made her look dangerous. She took my phone and read the message 3 times. Then she called Natalie immediately with no warning. Natalie answered, sounding happy and relaxed, and completely oblivious to how insane this entire situation was. Olivia didn't give her a chance to speak before unleashing. She said sending a photo of herself in Paris with Damien to her ex-fiancé 3 days after leaving him at the altar was sociopathic behavior, and she needed to check herself into therapy immediately. Natalie said she'd sent the photo to show me she was doing okay and following her truth. Olivia said nobody cared about her truth when she'd just devastated someone who loved her and planned a life with her. Natalie got quiet and said she thought I'd want to know she was safe. Olivia said safe wasn't the concern, common human decency was the concern, and Natalie seemed to have completely lost any sense of how her actions affected other people. She said the fact that Natalie was in Paris, the city we'd talked about for our honeymoon, made this even crueler and more thoughtless. Natalie said she hadn't thought about the honeymoon connection, and maybe sending the photo was a mistake. Olivia said maybe running off with a yoga instructor 2 days before the wedding was also a mistake, but it was too late for regrets now. Natalie hung up again. I sat there staring at the photo on my phone, feeling something shift inside me from hurt and confusion to anger and clarity. I'd spent the past 3 days questioning what I'd done wrong and how I'd missed the signs and whether I could have prevented this. But seeing that photo of Natalie in Paris looking happy and carefree while I dealt with the aftermath of her choices made me realize this wasn't about me at all. This was about her and her inability to commit and her need to run away when things got real. Olivia saw my face change and asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking about how I'd spent 5 years with someone who apparently didn't value me or our relationship enough to have an honest conversation before destroying everything. I said I was thinking about how Natalie had taken the easy way out by running instead of dealing with her doubts like an adult. I said I was thinking that I deserved someone who wouldn't abandon me at the altar and send photos from Paris 3 days later. Olivia smiled for the first time since seeing the photo and said that was the first smart thing I'd said since Saturday. She said being angry was healthier than being sad, and I should hold on to that anger because it would help me move forward instead of staying stuck in what-ifs and maybes. We stayed up late talking about everything except Natalie and the wedding. Olivia told me about her job doing freelance graphic design for tech startups and how she'd built a successful business after her Vegas marriage fell apart. She said hitting rock bottom had forced her to figure out who she was outside of relationships and family expectations. She'd moved to Seattle for 2 years to get distance from her parents and Natalie and everyone who had opinions about her life. She came back 6 months ago and was building a life on her own terms without needing anyone's approval. I asked if she regretted eloping to Vegas, and she said no, because it taught her valuable lessons about following impulses versus making real commitments. She said the difference between her and Natalie was that she'd learned from her mistakes, while Natalie kept repeating hers in different forms. I asked what she meant, and Olivia said Natalie had a pattern of getting close to commitment and then sabotaging it. The medical school acceptance she turned down. The job promotion she declined. The apartment lease she broke 2 weeks before moving in. Every time something required her to fully commit and follow through, Natalie found a reason to run. I realized I'd seen glimpses of this pattern, but explained it away as Natalie being cautious or thoughtful or careful about her choices. The rest of the week passed in a strange blur of normalcy and surreal moments. I went to work on Wednesday, and my co-workers treated me with exaggerated politeness like I might shatter if they mentioned anything personal. My boss called me into his office and said to take whatever time I needed, and the company supported me completely. I appreciated it, but also felt humiliated that everyone at my office knew I'd been left at the altar. I worked through the day focusing on spreadsheets and financial reports and anything that didn't require emotional energy. Olivia met me for lunch, and we ate sandwiches while discussing her current project, designing a website for a startup. It felt normal and comfortable, and nothing like the careful, managed conversations I used to have with Natalie where every topic was calculated to avoid conflict. Thursday, I received a call from an attorney named Diane Shapiro, who said Natalie had retained her to handle property division and lease termination. The clinical language made my stomach turn because it meant Natalie was treating our relationship like a business transaction. Diane asked if I had legal representation, and I said no, because I hadn't thought about needing a lawyer to end an engagement. She said I should probably consult someone to protect my interests regarding the apartment lease and shared property. I agreed and hired an attorney from my firm's recommended list. Friday afternoon, I got a call from my attorney, Gregory Thornton, who said he'd been in contact with Natalie's attorney about dividing our shared possessions and handling the apartment situation. He said Natalie wanted to buy out my half of the lease and keep the apartment. I said absolutely not, because I'd paid half the deposit and half the rent for 3 years, and I wasn't giving up my claim just to make her life easier. Gregory said that was a reasonable position, and he'd counter with either me keeping the apartment or both of us breaking the lease and splitting the penalties. He asked about the wedding gifts, and I said they should be returned to the guests since the wedding never happened. He said he'd communicate that to Natalie's attorney. Dealing with lawyers and property division made everything feel final in a way that sitting in a hotel room hadn't. This was really over. My relationship with Natalie was ending with legal documents and negotiated settlements instead of conversations and mutual understanding. I met Olivia at a bar after work and told her about the attorney calls. She said Natalie was probably panicking about the practical consequences of her choices now that the romantic Paris fantasy was settling into reality. She said Damien likely didn't have money or stability, and Natalie was realizing she'd traded a comfortable life for uncertainty. We ordered drinks, and Olivia asked what I was planning to do long-term since I couldn't stay in a hotel indefinitely. I said I'd probably look for a new apartment somewhere away from the one I'd shared with Natalie. Olivia suggested I consider leaving the city entirely and getting a fresh start somewhere new. She said sometimes the best thing after a major life disruption was changing everything instead of trying to rebuild in the same environment. I asked if she was speaking from experience, and she said absolutely, because staying in the same city after her divorce had been suffocating with constant reminders and awkward encounters. Moving to Seattle had given her space to figure out who she was without all the baggage. I said I'd think about it, but my job was here, and my family was here, and leaving felt like running away. Olivia said there was a difference between running away from problems and running toward opportunities. She said I should at least consider what I wanted my life to look like without Natalie in it, before defaulting to staying in a city that would constantly remind me of her. That night back at the hotel, Olivia asked if I wanted to watch a movie or if I needed space. I said I preferred company, because being alone with my thoughts was becoming dangerous. We settled on the bed with pillows propped against the headboard and put on some thriller neither of us had seen. Halfway through, Olivia fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, and I sat there very still, not wanting to wake her. The next morning, Olivia woke up embarrassed about falling asleep on me and apologized for crossing boundaries. I said it was fine and actually nice to feel like someone wanted to be close to me after Natalie had spent months pulling away. Olivia looked at me for a long moment and then said she needed to tell me something. She said she'd had a crush on me since the first time Natalie brought me to a family dinner 3 years ago. She said watching me with Natalie had been torture because she could see I was kind and genuine and deserving of someone who appreciated those qualities. She said she'd kept her distance and never said anything because I was with her sister and she had boundaries. But now that I wasn't with Natalie anymore, she wanted me to know how she felt. She said I didn't have to do anything with that information, and she'd understand if it was too complicated or weird given the situation. I sat there processing what she'd just said while my brain tried to catch up. I'd never thought of Olivia as anything except Natalie's sister, but looking at her now, I realized she'd been showing up for me all week in ways Natalie never had. She'd made sure I ate and slept and didn't fall apart. She'd defended me to her own family and cut off Natalie's attempts to minimize what she'd done. She'd been present and honest and real when everyone else was either pitying me or avoiding me entirely. I asked Olivia if she was sure this wasn't just proximity and emotion making her feel things that wouldn't last past this weird week. She said she'd been sure for 3 years and had never acted on it because of the situation. She said if I needed time to process or wanted her to back off, she would absolutely respect that. I said I didn't want her to back off because being with her felt natural in a way being with Natalie never quite had. Even at our best moments, Natalie and I had required constant management and careful navigation of her moods and needs. With Olivia, conversation flowed easily and silence felt comfortable, and I didn't have to monitor everything I said to avoid conflict. Olivia smiled and said we should probably take things slowly given the circumstances. I agreed, because jumping into something new days after my engagement ended seemed unwise, but I also reached for her hand and held it, because slow didn't mean not at all. We spent the weekend together not defining what we were doing or putting labels on anything. We got coffee and walked around the city and talked about everything from childhood memories to career goals to what we wanted from life. I learned things about Olivia I'd never known despite seeing her at family events for years. She'd backpacked through South America after college. She played guitar and wrote songs she never performed for anyone. She'd been in therapy for 2 years working through family trauma and relationship patterns. She was funny and smart and direct in ways that felt refreshing after years of Natalie's careful image management. Monday morning, I met with Gregory Thornton to discuss the settlement proposal from Natalie's attorney. They were offering me $15,000 to buy out my share of the apartment lease and claiming half the furniture since we'd acquired most of it together. Gregory said it was a fair offer financially, but I should make sure I was comfortable with it emotionally, since giving up the apartment meant giving up any remaining connection to Natalie. I said I wanted the apartment gone, and the furniture gone, and every reminder of our life together gone, because I was building something new. Gregory said he'd accept the offer with the stipulation that I keep a few specific items, including my desk and my grandmother's china, that Natalie had never liked anyway. We finalized the agreement and signed papers that officially ended my legal ties to Natalie. Walking out of Gregory's office felt like closing a door on 5 years of my life. It should have felt sad, but instead felt like relief and possibility. I called Olivia and told her it was done. She said we should celebrate and suggested dinner at this French restaurant she'd been wanting to try. I said French sounded perfect, and maybe we could pretend we were in Paris instead of dealing with the aftermath of Natalie actually being in Paris. Olivia laughed and said she liked the way I thought. Dinner that night was the first time being with Olivia felt like an actual date instead of friends supporting each other through crisis. She wore a dress and heels, and I wore a suit, and we sat across from each other at a small table drinking wine and talking about the future. I told her about the idea she'd planted about leaving the city and starting fresh somewhere new. I said I'd been researching opportunities in other markets and found several positions at investment firms in different cities. Olivia asked where I was considering, and I listed 3 options including Seattle where she'd lived before. She got very still and asked if I was serious about Seattle. I said I was serious about going somewhere that didn't have memories of Natalie around every corner. I said Seattle seemed like a good option professionally and personally if she was interested in going back. Olivia said she'd been thinking about leaving her parents' city again because being here after everything with Natalie felt claustrophobic. She said if I was seriously considering moving, she'd be interested in exploring that together. I reached across the table and took her hand and said I was very seriously considering it. We finished dinner and walked back to the hotel holding hands like we'd been together for years instead of days. Back in the room, Olivia kissed me for the first time, and it felt completely different from kissing Natalie. This felt easy and right, and like something that had been building for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The next 2 weeks moved quickly as I wrapped up loose ends and prepared for major changes. I gave notice at my firm, and they were surprisingly supportive about my decision to relocate. My boss said he understood needing a fresh start and would provide excellent references. I interviewed remotely with 3 firms in Seattle and received offers from 2. I accepted the position with the better compensation package and more interesting portfolio. Olivia started reaching out to her Seattle contacts about freelance opportunities and apartment options. We decided to move together, but get separate places at first to give ourselves space and not rush into anything too serious too fast. My parents were confused about my decision to move across the country weeks after my wedding fell apart. My mother asked if I was running away, and I said no, I was running towards something better. She seemed to understand and said she trusted my judgment. Natalie's mother called me crying and begging me to talk to Natalie, who was apparently having doubts about Damien in Paris and her entire life. I said I wasn't interested in talking to Natalie, and she should handle her doubts with her yoga instructor and her therapist. Natalie's mother said I was being cruel and unforgiving. I said Natalie had been cruel first, and I was just protecting myself from further damage. 3 weeks after the non-wedding, I received a text from Natalie asking if we could talk. I showed Olivia, and she said I should do whatever felt right for me. I decided to call because text conversations could be too easily misinterpreted, and I wanted absolute clarity. Natalie answered, sounding tired and uncertain. She said she'd made a terrible mistake leaving me at the altar and running to Paris with Damien. She said Damien turned out to be exactly what I'd warned her about, pretentious and superficial, and more interested in his image than actual connection. She said they'd fought constantly during their week in Paris, and she'd realized the chemistry she thought they had was just infatuation and yoga endorphins. She'd broken up with him 3 days ago and was staying in Paris alone trying to figure out what to do next. She said she wanted to come home and talk to me about potentially trying again. She said she understood if I was angry, but she hoped I could forgive her eventually, because what we had was real, even if she'd lost sight of it temporarily. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting, and then told her the truth. I said there was no trying again, because I'd moved on completely. I told her about Olivia and how we were moving to Seattle together. Natalie was silent for a long time, and then said I was dating her sister. I said yes, and it was the best decision I'd made in years. Natalie said that was a betrayal, and Olivia had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to steal me. I said Olivia hadn't stolen anything because Natalie had thrown me away first. I said Olivia had been there for me when Natalie ran away, and I wasn't apologizing for finding happiness with someone who actually valued me. Natalie started crying and saying this wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to have her adventure, and then come back, and I was supposed to be waiting because I always waited for her and accommodated her needs. I said that pattern was over, and she'd have to figure out her life without using me as a safety net. She asked what she was supposed to do now, and I said I genuinely didn't care as long as it didn't involve me. She hung up, and I sat there feeling nothing except relief that the conversation was over. Olivia came out of the bathroom where she'd been giving me privacy and asked how it went. I told her everything Natalie said, and Olivia shook her head, looking disgusted. She said Natalie had always expected the world to revolve around her and couldn't handle when people set boundaries. She said I'd done the right thing ending it definitively instead of leaving room for Natalie to manipulate her way back in. I agreed and felt lighter than I had since finding that note at the altar. The next week, Olivia and I flew to Seattle to look at apartments and finalize our plans. We found a neighborhood we both loved with coffee shops and parks and proximity to downtown. I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment with exposed brick and big windows. Olivia found a studio in the same building 3 floors down. We spent the weekend exploring the city and imagining our life there. It felt exciting and new and full of possibility in a way my life with Natalie never had. Back home, we packed our belongings and said goodbye to family and friends. My parents threw a small going-away dinner and told me they were proud of me for choosing myself instead of staying stuck in a situation that wasn't working. Kevin helped me load my stuff into a moving truck and said he'd come visit once I got settled. Natalie's mother showed up at my apartment unannounced the day before I left. She said I was making a huge mistake throwing away years with Natalie for a fling with Olivia. She said Natalie was sorry and deserved a second chance. I told her Natalie had years of chances and wasted all of them. I said Olivia wasn't a fling. She was someone who showed up and stayed when things got hard instead of running away to Paris. Natalie's mother called me ungrateful and said after everything her family had done for me, this was how I repaid them. I said her family hadn't done anything for me except raise a daughter who couldn't commit. I closed the door before she could respond. Olivia and I left for Seattle the next morning in a convoy with my moving truck and her car loaded with boxes. The drive took 3 days, and we stopped at motels along the way. Each mile felt like leaving the past behind and moving towards something better. We talked about plans and dreams and what we wanted to build together. We agreed to date seriously, but maintain separate apartments for at least 6 months to make sure this was real and not just reaction to the Natalie situation. We arrived in Seattle on a Friday afternoon and spent the weekend unpacking and setting up our new places. My first day at the new firm was Monday, and I was nervous but excited. The office culture was different from my previous job, more collaborative and less corporate. My co-workers were friendly and welcoming without prying into my personal life. I threw myself into work and quickly proved I deserved the position. Olivia landed several freelance contracts with Seattle tech companies and was building her business faster than expected. We fell into a routine of seeing each other several times a week for dinners or coffee or walks around the city. It felt healthy and balanced, and nothing like the codependent dynamic I'd had with Natalie. 3 months after moving to Seattle, I took Olivia to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the water. I told her I was ready to stop pretending we needed separate apartments for appearances. I said I wanted to find a place together and build a real life as partners. Olivia said she'd been waiting for me to be ready, and she wanted the same thing. We started looking at 2-bedroom apartments the next week. We found a place with a view of the Sound and enough space for both of us to work from home. Moving in together felt completely natural, like we'd been building toward this moment since the hotel room after the non-wedding. 6 months after leaving the altar, I was sitting on a couch in a Seattle apartment I shared with Olivia, watching rain fall against the windows. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it and saw a message from Natalie saying she was back in our hometown and wanted to apologize in person for everything. She said she'd been in therapy working through her commitment issues and taking responsibility for the damage she'd caused. She said she wasn't asking to get back together but wanted closure for both of us. I showed Olivia the text, and she said I should do whatever felt right. I thought about it for several hours and then replied to Natalie. I said I was glad she was getting help, but I didn't need closure because I'd already moved on completely. I said I wished her well, but we didn't need to see each other or talk anymore. She responded thanking me for being kind, even though she didn't deserve it. I blocked her number after that because leaving any line of communication open felt like leaving a door unlocked. Olivia noticed and smiled and said she was proud of me for choosing finality instead of leaving room for ambiguity. That night we were getting ready for bed, and Olivia came out of the bathroom wearing my old jacket, the leather one I'd left at the hotel that first night. I'd forgotten about it until seeing her in it. She laughed and said she'd been meaning to give it back but kept forgetting. I told her to keep it because it looked better on her anyway. She checked the pockets out of habit and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, and her expression changed to surprise. It was a plane ticket to Paris dated for what would have been my honeymoon week. I'd bought it months before the wedding and completely forgotten about it after everything happened. Olivia looked at the ticket and then at me. She asked if I wanted to use it, and I said the ticket was probably expired. She said we should check because Paris sounded perfect for our own trip without any Natalie associations. I looked up the ticket details and found it was actually still valid with a change fee. Olivia started researching flights and hotel options while I watched her get excited about planning our adventure. This felt right in a way planning the honeymoon with Natalie never had. This was spontaneous and fun and full of possibility instead of rigid schedules and controlled itineraries. We booked a trip to Paris for the following month. The plane tickets cost more than I wanted to spend, but Olivia insisted we do it right since this was our chance to reclaim the city from Natalie's disaster. We spent 2 weeks in Paris staying in a small hotel in the Marais and exploring the city without any agenda. We ate at cafes and walked along the Seine and visited museums and kissed in front of the Eiffel Tower like tourists without shame. It was everything I'd imagined a romantic trip should be, easy and joyful and full of moments I wanted to remember forever. On our last night in Paris, we were sitting at an outdoor restaurant drinking wine and watching people walk by. Olivia reached across the table and took my hand. She said she needed to tell me something important. I got nervous thinking she was about to drop some revelation that would change everything. She said she was in love with me and had been for a long time. She said watching me rebuild after Natalie had shown her exactly who I was, and she wanted to spend her life with someone that genuine and resilient. I said I was in love with her too, and had probably been falling for her since that first night in the hotel when she made sure I didn't completely fall apart. She said we should get married someday when we were ready, and I agreed, because marrying Olivia felt inevitable in the best possible way. We finished our wine and walked back to the hotel, holding hands and making plans for a future that actually felt stable and real. We flew back to Seattle and settled back into our routine, but everything felt different now. We'd said the words and made the commitment, and there was no uncertainty about where this was going. 4 months later, I proposed to Olivia on a Saturday morning in our apartment with no grand gestures or elaborate planning. I just woke up and knew I wanted her to be my wife and asked her while we were drinking coffee on the couch. She said yes immediately, and we spent the rest of the day calling family and friends to share the news. My parents were thrilled and said they'd always hoped I'd end up with someone who treated me well. Natalie's parents didn't speak to either of us, which was fine because we didn't need their approval or involvement. We planned a small wedding at a courthouse with just immediate family and close friends. No church ceremony, no country club reception, no 5-tier cake or ice sculptures, just us and the people who mattered making a commitment that felt real and lasting. The morning of the wedding, I woke up next to Olivia and felt completely calm. There was no doubt or fear or wondering if this was the right choice. This was the easiest decision I'd ever made. We got married on a Wednesday afternoon with Kevin as my best man and Olivia's cousin as her maid of honor. The ceremony took 15 minutes, and afterward we went to dinner at our favorite restaurant with 12 people who'd supported us through everything. It was perfect in its simplicity and authenticity. A year after the non-wedding, I was sitting in my Seattle apartment with my wife Olivia planning our first anniversary trip. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin saying Natalie had gotten engaged to some guy she'd been dating for 3 months. He sent a screenshot of her social media announcement with a photo of her and a man I didn't recognize. Olivia looked at the photo and said, Natalie looked the same as always, performing happiness for an audience instead of actually living it. I agreed and deleted the message without responding. Natalie's life and choices had nothing to do with me anymore. I had a career I loved and a wife I adored and a city that felt like home. Getting left at the altar had been the worst moment of my life, but also the catalyst for building something infinitely better. I looked at Olivia curled up next to me, researching restaurants for our anniversary, and felt grateful for every choice that led me here. She caught me staring and asked what I was thinking. I said I was thinking about how wearing her jacket that first night at the hotel had changed my entire life. She laughed and said technically I'd been wearing my own jacket, but she appreciated the sentiment. I corrected myself and said finding a plane ticket to Paris in the pocket of her jacket had changed everything. She kissed me and said some things were just meant to work out when the timing was finally right. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.